This video is for all of you who don't get it when it comes to nerd culture or geek philosophy in general. Maybe you can understand when kids like comics or gaming or animation or whatever, but you can't figure out why so many grown people are into it. And all this superhero stuff and sci-fi and fantasy, it seems to have taken over. And what about cosplay? When did it become a thing to dress up outside of Halloween or costume parties? Well, stick with me and I'll do my best to explain a few things. Well, if you're new to the channel, my name is Brian and we release new videos every week, so please consider subscribing and turning on the notifications so you don't miss out on any of the content. Like I mentioned, I'm going to be talking about how geek or nerd culture has become prevalent and accepted these days. To be clear, I use the terms nerd and geek with great affection and respect. I mean, I'm one of them. That said, welcome to Geek Philosophy, where we love geeky wisdom. And today, I'm going to try to explain why. I am not a psychologist, but I did have a few psychology classes back in college when I was studying to become a teacher, and I remember just enough to know that I am far from an expert. But I do remember discussing Erik Erikson's work on psychosocial development. I couldn't remember much, so don't give me too much credit. It's been a while. So I looked it up again in preparation for this video. Erik Erikson was a developmental psychologist, and he was credited as being one of the originators of ego psychology. And he spoke about 8 different stages of psychosocial development. I'm sure all of these stages have an impact on our love of geeky wisdom, but I want to focus on 2 of the developmental stages. But I'll put a link below in the doobly-doo if you want to read further about this stuff. First, I want to talk about stage 4, industry versus inferiority, which mostly occurs during elementary school, around ages 5 to 11. This is where you developed a sense of pride in your accomplishments and abilities through social interaction. Those successes helped you feel confident, and the failures led to a sense of inferiority at some level. From there, you moved into stage 5, which was identity versus confusion. And this is usually during adolescence or even the teenage years. And I think we can all agree that identity is really important here. Personal identity gives you a sense of self that will stick with you throughout the rest of your life, and it helped guide our beliefs and behaviors as we age. But what does this have to do with playing D&D or watching anime or dressing up like an elf? Again, not a psychologist, but my guess is your accomplishments and failures, your social interactions, and your development of your personal identity had a big role to play in it in one way or another. For example, there are some people who love sports. I mean, love it. They played a bunch when they were young, and maybe they excelled and learned that they were good at things. And now they know all about that sport, and maybe they even track statistics of their favorite team. I mean, they may even dress up in their favorite player's jersey or paint their face. I know, shocking, right? If that's you, by the way, you're a geek. You're just geeking out about a sport that you were connected with when you were young. Or you were joining in a social group that you thought was acceptable and cool. And in my mind, there is nothing wrong with any of that. But let's dig a little deeper. It occurs to me that much of this is somewhat dependent on your age, but I can honestly say that I think that people of all ages can relate to this if they look for the parallels in their own formative years. But I can only speak from my point of view, and I was born in 1978, which means, according to Erikson, my sense of pride and accomplishments was developed during the 80s, and my personal sense of identity was developed during the 90s, give or take a few years. I was never really into sports. I wasn't awful, but it didn't bring me the same sense of accomplishment or enjoyment that it did to others. I was into martial arts, and it's still a huge influence on who I am as a person. I'm as much of a martial arts nerd as I am a D&D, fantasy, sci-fi, and comic book geek. And I did form some community within the martial arts groups as well, but the world was different. Most people didn't watch martial arts competitions back then, or at least it wasn't as widespread and readily available as it is today. And the big box office draw was not the latest Marvel movie. Sure, there were some great, now classic, sci-fi and fantasy movies and shows, but there weren't as many and it wasn't as widespread as it is today. In fact, most of the stories being told in those big blockbuster movies today were being told in a 6 5/8 by 10 1/4 inch comic book, a paper comic book. And those stories were great. They just came packaged in a form that some people didn't respect as much as novels or even television, which is a shame. And for me, the comic book shop was one of those places where I knew everyone was in the same club. We were all fans, and instead of arguing about who the best football team was or who was going to win the big game that weekend, we would argue about who the best Marvel Comics character was. And the answer is Daredevil, by the way. What about Dungeons & Dragons, I hear you asking? Well, it was originally published in 1974, and I mentioned I came up during the 80s and 90s, right? So that must have been an awesome time for it. Well, if you weren't around back then, or you haven't watched the latest season of Stranger Things, it was mistakenly mixed up with some sort of devil worship, and the news stories kind of snowballed. Tom Hanks even starred in a really bad TV movie about this scare called Mazes and Monsters. So the Satanic Panic, as it was called, became pretty widespread during the 80s, and it even creeped into the 90s a little bit, depending on where you lived. And because most people didn't really take the time to understand what was happening, a bunch of us that played were scared to be lumped into that category. So finding other D&D players was kind of like trying to confirm there was a backroom bar during Prohibition. Psst. Psst. Shh. You play D&D? And I have to admit, it didn't stop with D&D. There was a certain amount of judgment about anyone who liked things outside of the mainstream. Not everyone, but some of the stereotypes did exist. Yes, there were kids who made fun of others who weren't popular. Yes, there were bullies who shamed people for not being good at or liking sports. And yes, there was even a comic book nerd table in my school cafeteria. Although, to be fair, at my school, it was likely because we all wanted to sit together and talk about comics or even draw comics. Sometimes we did that at lunch. Anyway, that's how things were. But what about how things are now? Hey, you remember those nerds I talked about who loved fantasy and sci-fi and comics and D&D and anime? Yeah, they grew up. And many of them became pretty successful. Some of them even pursued their dreams and succeeded. Some of them are now making the movies and TV shows and games they dreamed about when they were younger. And guess what? Turns out, people love it. Oh, and get this. Some of them found others who really liked them. Loved them even. They got together and had kids. Yeah. And those kids have gone through, or are going through now, those same developmental stages in a world where all that previously geeky stuff is now mainstream. To bring it back to D&D for a minute, one of the greatest things now is the ability to watch people play D&D online. Now, that may seem strange to want to watch other people play a game. Well, unless you are someone who watches esports, or really if you watch sports at all. But watching other people play D&D is eye-opening to me. Not just following the big-time shows like Critical Role, The Adventure Zone, or Dimension 20, but seeing how normal people play their home games. I find it really interesting to see how other people interpret the rules, and also all the different play styles that there are. I've learned how to be a better DM and player because of it. Access to the game has also expanded. In the past, with some exceptions, it used to be mostly white guys playing D&D. And there were all sorts of reasons for this, but I'm happy that there's a more diverse group of players in today's community. Or at least it's growing. So things have definitely changed, but that doesn't mean everything's perfect. There are still people who marginalize others for so many reasons, many of which aren't just related to their taste in movies or books or comics. The variety of prejudice and discrimination and bigotry is pretty bad right now, and discussing it would rightfully require a whole another video. I know, it was a long time getting to this point where we actually talk about why people like this stuff. I could spend the whole day talking about all the different genres that I'm into, but today I'm going to streamline things a bit, and I'm just going to focus on fantasy. And this is because fantasy tends to be polarizing. For example, some people don't think of fantasy novels as serious literature, which to me is completely short-sighted. But another reason I want to focus on fantasy is I think it's pretty inclusive. I could argue that gaming, movies, comics, animation, a bunch of other stuff can fit under that fantasy genre. But I'm only going to cover a few reasons why fantasy is awesome, but feel free to comment and add your own thoughts. First, it's an escape. J.R.R. Tolkien once said, "Fantasy is escapist," and that is its glory. If a soldier is imprisoned by the enemy, don't we consider it his duty to escape? If we value the freedom of mind and soul, if we're partisans of liberty, then it is our plain duty to escape and to take as many people with us as we can. For those of you who don't know who Tolkien is, he's an author most famous for writing The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, but he was also a professor at Oxford, and he fought for the British Army during the First World War. Life can be hard. There are times when the reality of the world can be overwhelming, and we just need a break from it all. While there are a lot of ways that people can cope with this, reading a good fantasy novel, watching an amazing movie, or playing a character in a fantasy role-playing game can be a healthy way to escape, and a healthy dose of fantasy can be a form of self-care. But it also promotes something that we don't often get in our everyday lives, a sense of wonder. And speaking of wonder, fantasy encourages imagination. As children, we experience wonder more frequently than we do as we age, and this sense of wonder helped develop humankind's most amazing traits, imagination. As children, we used imagination for pretend play, practicing what it was like to be someone else or be in different situations. In many ways, this helped us to test boundaries, experiment with social interaction, and develop empathy for others. And that is a really important one. Fantasy can explore imaginary people, places, situations, unique perspectives, and by connecting with characters who are so different from us in many ways, we begin to relate to them by looking at the ways in which they are similar to us. We see reflections of our humanity, all the good and all the bad, in the elves and gnomes and dragons or whatever in those stories. And when we close the book, or we end the game, or finish the movie, we're a little more likely to see ourselves in the other humans that we share the world with. But because some people see fantasy and imagination as childish, they miss out on enhancing the development of these skills as they mature. And I think that's a shame. As renowned author Neil Gaiman put it, we have an obligation to imagine. It is easy to pretend that nobody can change anything, that society is huge and the individual is less than nothing. But the truth is, individuals make the future, and they do it by imagining that things can be different. Perhaps ironically, fantasy is often about the real world. Some of the most insightful books I've read about the nature of humanity have been fantasy novels. Sure, they included fantastical worlds with magic or mysterious creatures, but they also had deeply compelling characters, and most included comments on the social realities of the world in the form of some kind of metaphor or allegory, which led to a complex examination of a lot of the real-world issues. And I read many of these types of books when I was in my teens. Without being preachy, fantasy changed my internal dialogue and helped me explore some complex moral questions. But don't give me too much credit. I didn't pick up fantasy books or comics because of all the intellectual stimulation or sociological exploration I've been talking about. Which brings me to the last reason. Fantasy is fun. No matter how much we dive into the intellectual, psychological, or sociological reasons we love fantasy, one reason stands above the rest. It's just fun. Fantasy is sometimes the best way to sneak in the veggies with the meal, so to speak. Because it's so fun, people don't realize they're receiving so many of the other benefits I mentioned. If philosophy is the love of wisdom, then to me, geek philosophy is the love of geeky wisdom. And if all of this is new to you, and you're still not really getting it, that's okay. The fact that you took some time to watch this video and learn a few things that you didn't know before, or at least get exposed to it, says something great about you. It says you may not be interested in all the stuff I am, but at least you're willing to learn a little bit more about it. That's huge. Fellow geek philosophers, thanks for sticking with me throughout this. Maybe you could share this with someone that you think could benefit from learning a little bit more about our geeky community. And leave a comment if you have something else that you'd like to share and add to the conversation. Well, I've had more than my usual share of quotes for this video, but I had to leave you with one more. An example of how great fantasy can provide some amazing insight into the real world. So I'd like to leave you with a little geek philosophy from one of my favorite fantasy authors, Patrick Rothfuss. It's the questions we can't answer that teach us the most. They teach us how to think. If you give a man an answer, all he gains is a little fact. But give him a question, and he'll look for his own answers. Cheers.